can I ask you, I don't know if you know who Michael Malice is, but in terms of constructing systems of incentives, it's interesting to ask. I don't think I've talked to you about this before. Malice espouses anarchism. So he sees all government as fundamentally getting in the way or even being destructive to collaborations between human beings thriving. What do you think? What's the role of government in a society that that thrives? Is anarchism at all compelling to you as a system? So like not just small government, but no government at all.
Yeah, I don't see how this would work. The government is an agent that imposes an offset on your reward function, on your payout metrics, so your behavior becomes compatible with the common good.
So the argument there is that you can have collectives, like governing organizations, but not government, like where you're born on a particular set of land, and therefore you must follow this rule, or else you're forced by what they call violence, because there's an implied violence here. So with government, the key aspect of government is it protects you from the rest of the world with an army and with police, right? So it has a monopoly on violence. It's the only one that's able to do violence.
So there are many forms of government. Not all governments do that, right? But we find that in successful countries, the government has a monopoly on violence. And that means that you cannot get ahead by starting your own army, because the government will come down on you and destroy you if you try to do that. And in countries where you can build your own army and get away with it, some people will do it, right? And these countries is what we call failed countries in a way. And if you don't want to have violence, the point is not to appeal to the moral intentions of people, because some people will use strategies, if they get ahead with them, that fill a particular kind of ecological niche. So you need to destroy that ecological niche. And if effective government has a monopoly on violence, it can create a world where nobody is able to use violence and get ahead. Right? So you want to use that monopoly on violence not to exert violence, but to make violence impossible, to raise the cost of violence. So people need to get ahead with non-violent means.
So the idea is that you might be able to achieve that in an anarchist state with companies. So with the forces of capitalism, is create security companies where the one that's most ethically sound rises to the top. Basically, it would be a much better representative of the people, because there is less sort of stickiness to the big military force sticking around, even though it's long outlived.
So you have groups of militants that are hopefully efficiently organized, because otherwise they're going to lose against the other groups of militants, and they are coordinating themselves with the rest of society. Until they are having a monopoly on violence. How is that different from a government?
I'm trying to
so it's basically
advocate.
Converging to the same thing.
So
right?
I think it always, so I was trying to argue with Malice, I feel like it always converges towards government at scale. But I think the idea is you can have a lot of collectives that you basically never let anything scale too big. So one of the problems with governments is it gets too big in terms of like the size of the group over which it has control. My sense is that would happen anyway. In this, so a successful company like Amazon or Facebook, I mean, it starts forming a monopoly over entire populations, not over just hundreds of millions, but billions of people. So I don't know, but there is something about the abuses of power the government can have when it has a monopoly on violence, right? And so that's a tension there. But
so the question is, how can you set the incentives for government correctly?
Yes.
And this mostly applies at the highest levels of government. And because we haven't found a way to set them correctly, we made the highest levels of government relatively weak. And this is, I think, part of the reason why we had difficulty to coordinate the pandemic response. And China didn't have that much difficulty. And there is, of course, a much higher risk of the abuse of power that exists in China because the power is largely unchecked. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what happens in the next generation, for instance. Imagine that we would agree that the current government of China is largely correct and benevolent, and maybe we don't agree on this. But if we did, how can we make sure that this stays like this? And if you don't have checks and balances, division of power, it's hard to achieve. We don't have a solution for that problem. But the abolishment of government basically would remove the control structure. From a cybernetic perspective, there is an optimal point in the system where the regulation should be happening, right? Where you can measure the current incentives and the regulator would be properly incentivized to make the right decisions and change the payout metrics of everything below it in such a way that the local prisoner's dilemmas get resolved, right? You cannot resolve the prisoner's dilemma without some kind of eternal control that emulates an infinite game in a way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which it seems like the reason government, the parts of government that don't work well currently, is because there's not good mechanisms for through which to interact, for the citizenry to interact with government. Is basically it hasn't caught up in terms of technology, and I think once you integrate some of the digital revolution of being able to have a lot of access to data, be able to vote on different ideas at a local level, at all levels, at the optimal level, like you're saying, that can resolve the prisoner dilemmas, and to integrate AI to help you out, automate things that are like that don't require the human ingenuity. I feel like that's where government could operate that well, and can also break apart the inefficient bureaucracies if needed. There'll be a strong incentive to be efficient and successful.
Throughout human history, we see an evolution and evolutionary competition of modes of government and of individual governments is in these modes. And every nation state, in some sense, is some kind of organism that has found different solutions for the problem of government. And you could look at all these different models and the different scales at which it exists as empirical attempts to validate the idea of how to build a better government. And I suspect that the idea of anarchism, similar to the idea of communism, is the result of being disenchanted with the ugliness of the real existing solutions and the attempt to get to an utopia.